Greetings and blessings, YouTube. This is John the Jansenist again for the second half of the second part on Ecumenism and Denominationalism. When I left you last, I was getting into the second message that was sent to me by One Truth Ministries. Now, continuing on. If you would read his works, you will find that he loved John Calvin and respected his school of thinking. Always seeking reconciliation, by the way. Also, he told his people to read Calvin's Bible commentaries, that they were the best. He often referred to Augustine in his preaching and whatnot. Alright, this does not tell us anything about the actual doctrine of Arminianism. There is always going to be some level of politeness and courteousness going on in these proceedings. You will note in the case of Augustine and Pelagius that Augustine did affirm that Pelagius was an outwardly righteous person who regularly performed deeds that were outwardly good and exhibited an outward piety. His heresy, obviously, however, remained a problem, and it led many people astray. Indeed, the most dangerous heretics are the ones who are given to an outward appearance of goodness. Let us take the example, the Bible verse that specifically states that Satan will appear in order to deceive as being an angel of light. That's a paraphrase, not a direct quote. I don't have the exact verse in front of me, but I will put it in the description. So this appeal does absolutely nothing for me, so I didn't address it at all. But just to finish this off. Arminians are accused of not affirming man's depravity when Arminius clearly states that he holds total depravity. Yes, but the important thing to remember is that total depravity no longer exists because of the prevenient grace that he has cleverly inserted in along with Christ's atonement that is universally sent out towards everyone. If men are totally depraved, they cannot discern spiritual things whatsoever. They are spiritually dead according to the New Testament. Now, if the New Testament asserted a prevenient universal grace, then by all good consequence we would not be dead in sin, we would simply be sickly in sin, and thus we are able in some sense to determine spiritual affairs with a right and proper judgment and actually come to God without need of further imputation of grace by our own free will. Total depravity is irreconcilable with the concept of free will as espoused by Arminius, or Molina, for that matter, who I believe was the chief influence on Arminius. Now, to close off this message, One Faith Ministry states, Luther and Calvin are nothing alike. That is a very ignorant statement. They weren't exactly the same. They had many divergences, but to state they were nothing alike is a testimony of a person's ignorance of history. But moving on. Luther was no Christian by his theology. He held heretical views on Holy Communion and baptism. He also said confession was a sacrament. He hated Jews, women, and the poor of Germany. Oh, this individual claims to be a Calvinist, but he sounds like the worst of the worst in Arminian circles. And he sounds about par for the course for your average Romanist apologist here. Let me just set the record straight on a few things here. You can criticize Luther's politics, and I do. I think that the concept of a state-run church is repugnant, and I think this was one of many errors that Luther committed. Now, with regards to his heretical views on Holy Communion, it is important to note that although Lutheranism espouses consubstantiation, which I myself reject as being in contradiction to the person and deity of Christ, the dual nature. Christ is wholly human, so he cannot be omnipresent, and this is also further expounded upon via tradition in the Chalcedonian Creed. He himself did not argue this. The best accounts that we have of Luther's view regarding the sacrament of Holy Communion was that of his debates with Zwingli. And Zwingli, as many may or may not know, being an early precursor of the Reformation, held that the Lord's Supper, or the Eucharist, as it were, Holy Communion, was nothing more than a remembrance, or what's the exact term that he used? A memorial. Now, this implies that there is no spiritual sanctification taking place. Ergo, communion is not really even a sacrament. It's simply an empty ordinance. So Luther, in response to this, highlighted the phrase, "This is my body." Now, he did not go any further and go into the end part of that particular chapter where he talks about these being matters of spiritual discernment. I differ with the Lutherans. I don't hold to consubstantiation for the same reason that I don't hold to transubstantiation. It is in contradiction with the New Testament, particularly that of the Gospels. We cannot believe that God became incarnate in flesh and that Christ was both wholly human and wholly divine if we take this viewpoint, because we are conflating the two natures and we're either mixing them or compounding them in some way in which is not specifically stated in the definition of a hypostatic union. Now, just to be clear here, I believe in essentially the same thing as what most Calvinists tend to believe with regards to the Eucharist, and that is that there is a spiritual presence in the sacrament itself as it is being performed for those of the elect who are having it performed for them, and that in lieu of this, our spirits are raised and brought into communion with the body of Christ seated at the right hand of the Father. Ergo, there is a dual real presence of us being present with Christ's body spiritually. We are being lifted up by the sacrament, and that Christ's spiritual presence is at the same time here with us when we are taking it in the physical form. This is the mystery of the real presence, and I assert this, and you also assert this in your profile. So again, I mean, Luther was only halfway through the process of reforming the entire church, and saying that he held a heretical view on Holy Communion is a little bit disingenuous. I'm sorry. Now, with regards to baptism, there is a divide between most of the Reformed and the Lutherans on this point, and I think Luther was pretty much on at this point. Luther's view on this was as such. He believed that because God is sovereign, that he would not allow a valid baptism performed validly to be contradicted by the actions of the elect. Ergo, he had a different understanding of what later became the doctrine of perseverance of the saints. He didn't get that far into actually coining a term for it, but his understanding of it was that specifically that even a person failed over and over again after his baptism, he was nonetheless confirmed in righteousness, and that eventually, by good necessary consequence, his sanctification would take place in due course, and he would be counted among those in heaven. Now, I don't fully agree with this because this tends to lean towards antinomianism, but I don't hold Luther in contempt over this. This is essentially him attempting to get himself out of Roman theology, yet not being able to get himself out of it. But clearly he was on the straight and narrow path, although he did not get as far as those who came after him did. And he also said confession was a sacrament. You know something? I say it is a sacrament too. In fact, I believe that every action committed within the context of church government is a sacrament in the sense that it is a sign and seal of a believer. They are not principal sacraments. They do not hold the same importance as the Lord's Supper and the sacrament of baptism because they are not specifically named. However, they are specifically ordained as proper church function via the New Testament. They're not explicitly mentioned in the Gospels as being sacraments, but they do take on a sacramental function in the case of the elect. This is a disagreement that I have with Calvinists, basically, and this is the reason why I'm not one, or one of the main reasons, basically. Now, on to the next section here, and this is where he really disappoints me. He hated Jews. Let me educate you about a little bit of history that you're probably not aware of. Now, I've read on the Jews and their lies several times, and it's very tempting as somebody who is not a Lutheran, which I'm not, to simply play gotcha and say, look at all you Lutherans, you know, the founder of your church is a raging anti-Semite. But instead, what I did is what every good student of history and theology should do. I went to the source of his complaints, in this case the Babylonian Talmud, which is held as the principal and authoritative collection of laws in Orthodox Judaism. This is Pharisee Judaism, basically. This is Judaism where the Talmud has essentially replaced the Torah, or the Old Testament. And I've linked to a website called The Truth About the Talmud, and this expounds upon some of the rubbish that the rabbis in the time of the Reformation were teaching. And essentially this has been the standard teaching of most Orthodox Jews since the time of Jesus, and we have accounts of it still being enforced up until the 1980s in Israel. So let me just get down to a couple of the more racy parts of the Talmud here, just to get a basic idea of why it is that Luther would have reacted so negatively to rabbis' teaching in Germany. And again, you have to take into account that Luther did not have all the information regarding the Roman complicity and the money-lending nonsense, and how a lot of Jews ended up getting scapegoated for things that they weren't necessarily all doing. The Jewish scribes claim the Talmud is partly a collection of traditions Moses gave to them in oral form. These had not yet been written down in Jesus' time. Christ condemned the traditions of the Mishnah, or the early Talmud, and those who taught it, scribes and Pharisees, because the Talmud nullifies the teachings of the Holy Bible, or the Torah at this point, since the New Testament had not yet been written. Shmuel Safrai, in The Literature of the Sages, Part 1, page 164, points out that in chapters 4 and 5 of the Talmud's Gritten Tractate, the Talmud nullifies the biblical teaching concerning moneylending. Hillel decreed the prosbul for the betterment of the world. The prosbul is a legal fiction which allows debts to be collected after the sabbatical year, and it was Hillel's intention thereby to overcome the fear that moneylenders had of losing their money. And we go further down the line, and we go through some of the teachings of the Talmud, and we find some really ridiculous stuff, like penalty for disobeying rabbis. Whosoever disobeys the rabbis deserves death and will be punished by being boiled in hot excrement in hell. Let me see here. Sanhedrin 58b. If a Gentile hits a Jew, the Gentile must be killed. Sanhedrin 57a. A Jew need not pay a Gentile the wages owed him for work. And then we go down further on the line, and here's a nice little juicy one. Baba Kama 113a. Jews may use lies and subterfuges to circumvent a Gentile. This sounds a lot like Jesuitic teachings, which I'm sure most Reformed Christians would condemn, but apparently they're silent when the Talmud is concerned on this, probably mostly because they haven't read it. So it goes down, and there's a ton of really horrid blasphemies against Jesus Christ. Here's a couple of them. He and his disciples practiced sorcery and black magic, led Jews astray into idolatry, and were sponsored by foreign Gentile powers for the purpose of subverting Jewish worship, and that's found in Sanhedrin 43a. 2. He was sexually immoral, worshipped statues of stone, and a brick is mentioned, was cut off from the Jewish people for his wickedness, and refused to repent. This is Sanhedrin 107b, and it was also in Sotah 47a. And number 3, he learned witchcraft in Egypt, and to perform miracles used procedures that involved cutting his flesh, which is also explicitly banned in the Bible, Shabbos 104b. And it goes down the line from there. They accuse Mary of being a fornicating whore, and Jesus being a bastard son as well. Now, let me ask all of you of the Reformed faith who view Martin Luther as being some sort of raging anti-Semite. Let me just ask you this. Is any of the stuff that I just referenced in here, do you believe that any of it is true? Do you believe this? If not, then you essentially agree with Luther on the point that the Jews are spreading lies. I mean, you might not agree with Luther's really heavy-handed response to this stuff, but let's face this. It's a bunch of lies. And I'm not going to tolerate it being taught to anybody that I know without it being challenged. So anyway, I'm going long on this one, so I'm going to have to continue with part 3 on this. So until next time, in nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, God be with you all.